afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar on recognizing and responding to dyslexia in adults. Today, the webinar is hosted and sponsored by our partners at Reading Horizons, and I'm going to turn it over to our presenter, Laura Axtell.
Thank you so much. Give me just a moment. I'm going to share my screen. And we're going to be watching some videos today. So I'm also going to be making sure that the sound is available for everyone. All right, so well, that should be good. Thank you so much for joining us. I think that the large number of attendees and people who registered, as well as just seeing so many people from so many different places, speaks to the importance of this topic. So as I often do, I would really like to start by having a poll. And so our first question is going to be, and they're going to be yes or no. So do you suspect that a significant number of your students have dyslexia? Yes or no? So this is for people working in adult ed settings or correctional settings. Of the students that you're directly working with, what do you think? And we'll take a look at those results in just a second. Okay, so 68% of you think yes. And then the second question is, do you feel as knowledgeable as you would like to about recognizing dyslexia in your students? And that was overwhelmingly no. So great, this is a perfect segue into what we're going to be talking about today. I would like to ask a question though in the chat. So of those of you who said yes to the first question, that you suspect a significant number of your students have dyslexia, what are you seeing? What have you observed that has led you to suspect that there might be dyslexia? And if you could put that in the chat, that would be really helpful. So let's talk about what we know. There's a lot of data around this topic, and part of that is connected to just generally literacy in the United States. So recent studies show that about 54%, over half of US adults read below a 6th grade level. And so that's about 130 million adults between the ages of 16 and 74 that have very low literacy skills. About 1/5 of all students with a high school diploma also read below a 6th grade level. And for adults in custody, 70% read below a 6th grade level. So this is a significant population, and in many ways, the data shows that it's growing. So I want to talk specifically about corrections for a moment. That statistic is so high, 70%. And so there have been several studies on this topic, but one that I want to highlight, which is very recent, was done in 2 maximum security prisons in Louisiana, and it was done with both men and women, which is valuable because dyslexia isn't gender specific. And what they found based on the study was that 47% of the students in the study were classified as having dyslexia or characteristics of dyslexia. 47%, almost half. 36%, or about a third, were reading proficiently, and another 17% were classified as having cognitive impairments. So between around 64% of students either had characteristics of dyslexia or cognitive impairments. So 2/3 of the students were struggling with, literacy and things related to literacy. And that's important to understand. So what's particularly valuable about the studies that have been done is that they show that this percentage in corrections is much larger than the prevalence in the general population, which is basically considered to be about 20%. So more than double that. And this is the other key component of that. If we think this doesn't matter, it does, because, and I mean, to a larger society, because we know that reading failure is significantly linked to academic failure, which leads often to delinquency, violence, and crime. So this isn't just something that's for corrections. This is something that affects all of us, because most of our adults in custody are coming home. And in response to that, in 2018, the First Step Act was passed, and that called for federal prisons to screen prisoners for dyslexia. I have talked to people in federal prisons, and my understanding is that that's been implemented with varying degrees of success. So if we have anybody on who's working in a federal prison, I would love to have you share what your experience has been. Is screening happening? Do you think it's valid screening? And does that lead to getting additional services for students who are characterized as having characteristics of dyslexia? So I want to talk first about the impact of dyslexia in adults, because often when we're working with adults in adult ed settings, people talk about motivation. They talk about sometimes resistance or reluctance, but I think we have to see why that exists and where that's coming from. And so the dyslexia iceberg is a helpful way of identifying why that might exist. So just like all icebergs, you've got what you see on top, which in this case is often difficulties with reading, writing, and spelling. But what exists beneath that? And so I'm just going to talk about a few of them. The first is stress, anxiety, and low self-esteem. And you'll see why in just a moment. But there's a lot of other factors that can be affected as well. Working memory, because the cognitive demand, when you've got dyslexia, it makes it difficult to hold on to current knowledge while you're learning something new. Other things like processing speed, students may need to go much more slowly. Organization and all the executive functions like organizing and time management. Auditory and visual processing, you're going to see this in some videos in a second, because a lot of times we talk about things, but you've never seen it. You don't know what that looks like. So I want to make sure you understand it. It often shows up in handwriting and other areas as well. So what we see, and then what may be beneath that. So with the Matthew effect, what we know is that a lot of times this has been an existing problem since these students were very, very young in primary school. And so what we would typically expect is that starting in kindergarten, you learn how to read and spell and all those things. And over time, you get progressively better so that your skills are commensurate with your age, grade level, etc. But what happens for students who have dyslexia and other print-based challenges is they don't get better. In fact, they plateau. So they start out trying to learn, and then at some point, if they don't get the proper kinds of instruction and support, they just don't get any better. And so the Matthew effect is the rich get richer, the poor get poor. In this case, good readers get better, poor readers do not, and they never will. So age isn't the factor anymore. And what's really important about that is many of our students, I've had lots of conversations with many of you probably about this, but often our students think that because they struggle with reading or spelling or many of the other characteristics that we see, that they're stupid. And they'll often say that. That's the core belief since you were probably pretty young, that if you can't read, there must be something wrong. And that is, nothing could be further from the truth. Lots of studies have confirmed that there is no correlation between dyslexia and IQ. In fact, many students with dyslexia are average or above average intelligence. So for many years, there was a formula called the discrepancy formula that was used to identify dyslexic students, and that is no longer supported. So we don't just compare an IQ to achievement. There are much better ways to assess for dyslexia. And we know that this is neurological. It's happening on the left hemisphere of the brain. So that tells us that we need to do some things differently with this population. So I'm going to show a video. This to me is the best short example of what we're talking about when we talk about impact. And then I'd love to hear your comments.
Okay, no puede hacer nada, okay, fill this out and bring it back to the desk.
Señorita, deja de decir lo mismo.
So do you think that gentleman feels intelligent? What emotions are you experiencing when you can't do the basic kinds of things in life? And what's really important about this wasn't about getting an education. This is about something that's important in your life. Dealing with an illness of a child, dealing with school records. These are scenarios that happen every single day. And a lot of these students they don't know that they have dyslexia. Nobody's ever talked to them about dyslexia. So they just believe that they're stupid. And that leads to, what's the most common feeling you think that gentleman experienced when he looks around and he can't do something to care for his child? Shame and embarrassment are huge with this population. So one of the things we have to start with is recognizing dyslexia. And we're going to share a bunch of resources and tools for doing that. And then what do we do about it when we recognize that a student may be experiencing dyslexia? So this definition is the one adopted by the International Dyslexia Association. It is the most widely used definition when states are adopting dyslexia legislation, et cetera. And it's very worthwhile looking at their definition. So number one, dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. That means that neurological, because this is a left brain, full brain issue, but particularly in the left brain. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Biological, because there's a huge genetic component to dyslexia. So most of the studies show that dyslexia can, really travel through families. And immediate families members have a higher chance of passing that on to an offspring. So neurobiological, but it is characterized by difficulties with, and this is the primary characteristics we would see: difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition, and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. So if a student has difficulty with that accurate word recognition, spelling, and decoding, that gives us a real clue. And those difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language, so that sound piece that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities. So again, IQ isn't a factor. And the provision of effective classroom instruction. So even after instruction, even after somebody who's been through school, we're still seeing those difficulties. Those are key factors. Secondary consequences, and this is also important because we focus so much on comprehension in the past and vocabulary and those upper level skills. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. So often we'll see that. Limited background knowledge, limited vocabulary, etc. But is comprehension really the issue here? And so when we're talking about dyslexia from a neurological viewpoint, we know that speech is naturally occurring, but print is not. The brain has to connect neural pathways that are primarily three language centers on the left hemisphere. And so a student with dyslexia, and these scans were done by Sally Shaywitz and many other researchers years ago, when we could see what the brain was doing while it was reading. So we now know that what we are not doing is just focusing on comprehension and close reading strategies and many of the other things that we were taught to do. It's that we must do some things that are very specific to wiring those neural pathways. So when we look at the components of effective reading instruction, often that pyramid, people have seen that, and our goal, of course, is comprehension. However, what is the real cause when students are having difficulty with comprehension? And we really have to go to the bottom of the pyramid to see where those struggles exist, because as we just talked about that in definition, it often starts at the phonological component, the sound. So
Read one sentence.
I thought it would be valuable for you to see what this looks like. So this is a 13-year-old who is essentially a non-reader. And I just want you to listen to this student attempting to decode. And you can see these words are very, very simple. Sentences are very, very simple. And the student has already had some connection here to before he starts reading these sentences. So I'm just going to play a little bit of this and then you can respond.
Well, I'm going to give you the longest one. All right. So what's his name first? Nope.
Neb.
Is that a B or a D?
D.
Mm-hmm.
Ed. Ed.
Start with your first sound.
Ed. Ed.
Yeah, but start with your first sound.
Ed.
Yeah, but what's your first sound? N.
N.
Ned.
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 Had a app.
Yeah, but you got to start with your first sound.
App. Nap.
Nap. Good.
And
What's this letter?
and then
Den. So do you know what a den is? Like a TV room, like some people, like some people call the TV room. Excellent. Okay, one more sentence. That was the longest sentence, so that was great.
Sap is not
Is it? Wait. Don't go too fast. Is
not.
There's no. It's what's your first sound though?
Odd.
On.
No. Log.
Okay, so say it one more time.
The sap is on the log.
Okay, so since you know what sap is, what are they talking about? What does that mean?
Tree sap. They're getting tree sap from maple syrup.
Absolutely. Okay.
Okay, so what you've just seen is what was originally referred to as word blindness. Before the term dyslexia existed in about 1883, it was called word blindness. So you can see that the brain doesn't necessarily even recognize in print what's right in front of them. You also see that he struggled with reversals. So not telling the difference between a D and a B. And he also has some articulation issues, make it difficult for him to pronounce certain sounds. And so a student like this, why am I showing you a 13-year-old? Because 13-year-olds grow up. And if this student doesn't get the right kinds of intervention, he'll become an adult that doesn't read any better. So let's look at an adult and a different component of dyslexia. So this is something called dictation. Again, a technique to wire the brain, where we go between spelling and decoding and encoding.
Snub. Like if somebody snubs you or gives you the snub, it means they like ignore you or like don't acknowledge you. So snub. So repeat it.
Snub.
So focus on your blend first.
It's so hard to hear the second letter. I just hear the rest of the letters.
That's why you have to really stretch it out.
Snub. 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 I don't know.
Well, what's your first sound?
It starts with a S, but I can never hear.
Now okay, so let's do it this way. I'm going to stretch it out and I want you to practice doing it the same way. And actually you can count the sounds. That may make it easier. So
Snub.
Look at my mouth. What letter is that?
N.
Look at me.
Up.
It's hard to hear, isn't it?
Yeah.
So let me just tell you that when you decode it off the cards, it's easier. When you have to listen, and now what you're doing is encoding or spelling, it's hard. So snub. What's your last sound?
B.
Snub. B. Okay. Mark
Like
it.
this.
Excellent.
Snub.
Okay. Okay, so now we're going to do something else. I'm going to spell a word, and then we're going to go through it step by step, and then you're going to tell me what the word is, okay? And this involves another blend that you've already had. All right, so you ready? I'm going to spell a word. You're going to write it. Ready?
Okay.
So TWIST. Now, starting at the beginning of that word, TW is a blend, right?
Yeah.
So arc your blend. X under your vowel I. And
then
ST is a
this.
blend. Yeah, so you got two blends. Okay, now tell me what that word is.
Or West. West.
Yeah, but you have to start at the beginning and get that first whole blend in.
W. With. Wait.
Yeah, but you
West.
got to start with the very first sound.
W. Is. W. Is. This was confusing.
Okay, so do you notice in both cases, they have a really hard time getting the first sound? It's like once their eye goes past that, coming back to the beginning of a word is really challenging. And this is also the two of the best examples I've ever seen with both of these students where he says, I can't hear the second sound. So, you know, even though, I mean, he literally, that phonology piece is so incredibly important, connecting sounds and letters, how many sounds, that phonological awareness piece that they mentioned in the definition shows up here big time. So again, this is an adult who has been through school and who struggles that extensively with the basics of language. And it occurs in both directions, spelling and reading. Spelling is actually the harder, right? So it's important to see those because are these students going to have access to the kinds of goals that generally we see students trying to attain in adult ed? Is a student who's a non-reader, can't spell, has very limited background knowledge and often vocabulary, able to attain GED or vocational training, employment, for all the reasons we've talked about. And when students are learning English on top of that, that can make it incredibly challenging. So we're going to talk a little bit about English language learners. And there's a webinar coming next month that's going to focus specifically on English language learners. But so now that we've kind of seen it and we know some of the characteristics, how do we do a better job of screening for it in the populations that we're working with? So one easy way is that we've developed a dyslexia screener that's online. It's free and confidential. Generally what happens is you would fill it out, or a parent would fill it out. Somebody who's worked very closely with the student and knows enough to be able to understand or to identify at least some of the characteristics. It doesn't store any data. You don't put a name in or anything like that. So if you want results, there's a print page at the end, but as soon as you print it, that information will be gone. So it's a way of helping people identify those, and it'll ask you to put in an age. So there are 3 screeners for children because dyslexia can look different developmentally, and any age you put in past 18 will take you to the adult screener. There are 23 items in that screener. So this is just an example. And some of these you may not know. For example, you may not know if anybody in the immediate family, unless the student knows and tells you that. But what is valuable about this is that for every single item, there's also a way to view the research. So you can see how do we know that's a characteristic of dyslexia? Where did that come from, for example? So many times people use the online screener as a way of kind of really understanding what are the characteristics we see in adults. And then also to use that sometimes as a screener. But we've also created a couple of other ones, and we'll share this as a resource. So this is a paper and pencil adult screener with 12 items that are the most common we would see in our populations. And it's just a way of somebody who's, again, working with a student. What are you seeing? Or you can ask the student if you want to know specifically about some history here. This one was actually created because correctional partners asked us for something that could be easily done during receiving when a student is coming into the system and they're getting their medical and educational and all of that, but it could be used anywhere. So it's 6 items that you would ask the student, maybe as part of a screening or enrollment process in adult ed or something, so that you get their information directly about what is affecting them. And that can be really, really useful just as a preliminary way of identifying what challenges they've been, you know, that they've had over the years, right? So let's talk about research-based reading instruction. So we know, and our last webinar focused a lot more on this, but with this population particularly, you have to target the unique needs because there's such a range of diversity and needs. Dyslexia can range from very mild to very severe, and you don't know until you start working with a student sometimes how severe that, how severe they are on the spectrum. Again, there's been a lot of frustration, shame, and embarrassment. And one of the things that's very helpful is if you can start to get some success right away, that they see that there's something different about the kind of instruction they're doing, and that we're not just reading for comprehension, but we're actually addressing some of the core issues that they have. And again, mitigating discouragement, because when they see that there's hope and that they can make progress, that often shifts everything. And then also having resources that can leverage, their time, and that can be more self-directed and done independently for adults. That's really, really, really important. And how does that happen? Well, there are two primary components. One is a better understanding of the science of reading and structured literacy, which is really the approach that is most effective for working with students with it, for instruction for everybody, but also for intervention for students with dyslexia. And we know from the simple view of reading that in order to understand what we're reading, to gain meaning, we have two components. One is the decoding of text, and the second is comprehension of language, vocabulary, understanding what words mean. But with students with dyslexia, decoding is the primary difficulty for most of the time. And so we really have to make sure that is addressed. So structured literacy is really that key component that gives us the approach that students need. And what that means is that the instruction is going to be explicit, systematic, cumulative, and diagnostic. And that we start with those are the principles of structured literacy, and the inner elements are what we actually teach. So phonology, sound symbol correspondence, morphology, etc. So we did do a webinar on this last month called Remedying the Adult Reading Rift, and we spent a lot more time talking about the specifics of structured literacy and what that would look like in a lesson, and what good solid literacy programs look like. So I'd recommend that you watch that if so. So step one, really, in terms of identifying dyslexia, are screener surveys and inventories that are more specific to the phonological and decoding and encoding skills that we need to identify. So there are a couple of free ones. You can find a lot of these online. I would love if you would put in the chat if you're using any of these, or what your success has been in terms of using screeners to identify students that will need more support and targeted instruction. So one is the core phonics survey. There's another quick, the QPS, which is the quick phonics screener. And then the QUARI is the quick adult reading inventory. Again, those are all readily accessible. Another one is Sylvia Green's informal word analysis inventory. Some of you in adult ed or corrections may be using that already. The nice thing about this inventory is it has both reading and spelling inventories. Sometimes students with milder dyslexia don't show up as readily because they can read, or they found accommodations and ways to kind of they've memorized a lot of words and things like that. Spelling really will help point out a lot of times where there is a discrepancy. And many of you are probably familiar with beta reading and language inventory. The nice thing about the beta is that it includes an English language ELL quick start. And so that can be really valuable as well. Step two is sound symbol correspondence. So as you just saw in the video, one of the biggest components is the sound symbol correspondence, getting letters and sounds connected to each other. And so when we encode, we're segmenting. So if you hear the word bag and we go to spell it, your brain is literally segmenting into those three sounds, bag. And then when we're reading, we're blending. We're going to tie all those together now and blend them. And that can be a major challenge for a lot of our students. So a lot of times, because students are older, we think we don't have to go back and assess this level of understanding, and we do. It's apparent in the definition we just went over, and from the videos that we watched, that is a definite issue for many of our students, especially those with moderate and more severe dyslexia, that this is a key component. The other parts of phonemic awareness have not been found to be as necessary, but this is what we know, and this is a resource I shared in the last webinar as well. If you want to get the most comprehensive understanding, I recommend this book all the time. I think people find it valuable. And basically what the elements of research validated instruction include are that they aggressively address and correct students' phonological awareness difficulties, as we just mentioned, that they provide phonic decoding instruction and reinforcement. The connection to sounds and letters and phonics is incredibly important. And third, that it provides students with ample opportunities to apply developing skills to reading connected text. That was the topic of the last webinar that I just mentioned about connecting to reading proficiency. So it's really a three-step transfer for many of our students. In many cases, our students with moderate to severe dyslexia are going to need a lot of supports in the beginning with decodable words and sentences and passages so that they get the opportunity to practice developing skills in text. Many times, though, the next step, or for students who are further along or have milder dyslexia, having something that's a controlled reading like a Lexile level passage, where the vocabulary is more complex and where students can apply those skills if they're able to do so. But the goal is always to get them into connected text, authentic connected text that is connected to their goals and to their preferences, what's relevant to them in their lives. And then we talked about that in the last webinar as well. I do want to talk a little bit about multilingual learners and dyslexia because a lot of questions come up about this. So when we're talking about second language acquisition, this is essentially true for all learners of a second language. So we talk about 5 levels of English language development, and stage 1 is when you're just coming new to a language. So we would call them newcomers. And speaking and listening are the most important initial skills. You have to be able to have survival English. That can be everything from greetings to basic, the ability to communicate for things that are important, like going to the bathroom or, finding a hospital, those kinds of things. But production is very limited at this point. So it's mostly, receptive language, less expressive. But then when we move into stage 2, the goal is to begin connecting to some print and also tier 1 vocabulary, which tier 1 vocabulary is, again, those everyday kinds of words that students would encounter in almost every setting. As we go into stage 3, and we're, now we're getting into more print and conventions and things like that of the language. Every language has a syntax or word order, grammar, spelling, those kinds of things, and an introduction to tier 2. Tier 2 vocabulary is vocabulary connected generally to across subject areas. So for example, words like conclude or analyze or compare can be found in any subject area. And so students start to connect to those kinds of terms that would be very apparent in academic kinds of text. And then as they get into the upper stages, then we're getting into additional tier 2 and tier 3 vocabulary. Tier 3 vocabulary is generally specific to a particular subject like science or math. So words like photosynthesis, osmosis, things like that. So obviously with language, we're working on the second language, we're working on the 4 domains: speaking, listening, reading, and writing. And we would do that using a structured literacy approach as well, because again, we're wiring the brain. We're creating neural pathways for the second language as well. Our goal is, of course, for students who are going into higher levels, our academic is to get them to stage 5. That's generally where in a school setting, students would be exited from an ELD program because they are determined to be generally pretty proficient in all areas. But we know that dyslexia exists across languages, all languages. So we don't really know for sure. Rather, a student's difficulties in the beginning are just language-based because maybe they have no formal education, even in their L1, in their first language. And so if you don't have print in your first language and the brain isn't wired for recognizing print and things like that, or if you're coming from a language that doesn't use a Roman alphabet like English, those can be incredible challenges. So phonology, again, we start with that phonology because many sounds are not found, many of the English sounds, 44 sounds in English, are not found in other languages, or they have sounds that don't exist in English. So that can be a really important challenge coming from one language to another. So we start at the same place we would start with the students we've already been talking about, with that phonology, sound symbol correspondence. Having tools to support that can be very valuable. But we're going to start at the beginning with all students, and we're going to move up through, the alphabet, decoding, spelling, all the same kinds of skills, and then connecting to those tiers of vocabulary as students move into, if their desire is to move into more academic English. We know that dyslexia does exist across languages. And so a lot of times the question is, how do we know? How do we know if it's really just they need more time and more support to acquire the language, a second language or English, or if there's dyslexia going on? And the answer is, in the beginning, you probably don't. This book by Elsa Cardenas-Hagen, she's really kind of the foremost expert in this field, and there are some wonderful YouTube videos, if you look up videos by her, that talk about English language learning and learning disabilities. There's some really good videos that help explain that, but these are kind of some takeaways. One is, where possible, she recommends that you assess in a native language, so in their L1. So if they're a Spanish speaker and you have the resources to be able to assess in that first language, that can be really helpful, because phonological difficulties will show up often in that language as well. Second, it may take them much longer to just understand and develop speaking and listening skills in English. So even though there's been lots of repetition, they're struggling with a lot of that. A lot of times we'll see that they're much slower than their peers, even after lots of instruction and repetition. So sometimes just that it's taking them much longer, they're much slower, doesn't necessarily mean that's dyslexia. It's just something to be aware of. Another thing, and what she talks about, is progress. The same way we would see this in a student that's an English speaker. We're doing good instruction, good solid instruction, and we see that some students are just not grasping it as quickly. They're not making as much progress, or they're much slower. And I'm working with a student that is an English language learner, and this is exactly what I saw. Lots of instruction, many, many more repetitions, and still struggles a lot. So my suspicion is, because we don't use those screeners that I mentioned, unless it's an EL specific screener, we don't use them to assess for an English language learner, unless it's specifically designed for that. So as you're going through instruction, just seeing that they are taking much longer and not making as much progress, or that they need a lot more support, like vowel cues, those kinds of things. And you'll start to see similar patterns as you would with an English language, or with an English speaker who's got dyslexia. So maybe they're generally doing okay in the simpler skills, but they get to a certain point and they really begin to struggle, maybe with those more complex words. And that's not what you've typically seen with your other English language learners. So again, where you can have students who speak that language do translations or use apps to do that, anything that you can use to support them, because often this is a many-year process for them. And again, you won't know this until you start working with a student and address the language issues first, and then start to begin to see that there may be additional challenges as well. I want to share some additional resources on dyslexia, because I think that's important. We talked about screeners. We talked about, that sound symbol correspondence, and making sure that we're identifying rather students have a solid understanding of sound symbols, letters and sounds together, and then going into the structured literacy piece. That usually requires a curriculum or something that is, you know, structured literacy. So explicit, systematic, cumulative, and diagnostic. But there are some additional resources. In addition to the book I mentioned, the International Dyslexia Association has some great resources on their website, Dyslexia at a Glance. And so it gives you lots of information. There's an FAQ about dyslexia and things like that, because really, as instructors, our goal is to learn as much about dyslexia as possible, so we recognize it when we see it and therefore can address it more effectively. Kind of the primer on dyslexia is Sally Shawitz's book, which is now in a second edition, called Overcoming Dyslexia. So again, if you want an entire book specifically on dyslexia, it's a great one to have. They are also offering through the Yale Center for Dyslexia and Creativity a free course on dyslexia. So if you go to coursera.org and search for dyslexia, it's a 12-hour course. You can get a certificate at the end if you want to. The course is free. I think you pay for the certificate. But again, if you're working with a population that where you're seeing significant numbers of students with dyslexia, it's probably valuable or can be recommended to other people who are. So that's another way to get a lot of information. So I'm going to stop here really quickly and see if we have some questions. Yeah, so you will get a copy of the recording and a copy of the slides PDF'd after today's webinar, as well as some additional resources. So yes, you'll definitely get all those resources. So and the National Reading Panel and NPR mentioned that the statistic 1 in every 5 Americans are affected by dyslexia. Yes, so that's about 20%. That's the prevalence that is most commonly cited across research studies. So dyslexia, this is where it gets a little challenging. Dyslexia can be a specific diagnosis, but generally in most states, the only people who are allowed to give diagnoses are medical doctors or neuropsychs. And that is a challenge because when somebody assesses for dyslexia, if it's a school-age child, most schools don't use the term dyslexia yet. That's changing. It's still a specific learning disability in reading. So the whole point is that, you know, most of our students will never have a true diagnosis of dyslexia. So, and it doesn't really matter when you start to see the characteristics, either because of what the work you're doing with the student or from a screener, you want to do the same things we talked about. We're going to screen for those characteristics that we see in adults that are indicative of dyslexia. We're going to check for sound symbol correspondence, and we're going to provide an approach that is based on structured literacy. That's the most effective, most effective way to address, instruction across the board. Dr. Selznick is on here. Dr. Selznick helped us create the screener, so very happy to see him. And many states are still resistant to using the term dyslexia, but again, that is changing quite a bit. Visual distortion. I would love to discuss visual distortions, but I'm not going to do it here because that's an entirely different topic. So Erica, please feel free to reach out to me. So you saw on the dyslexia iceberg that there was a comment about visual stress. And so sometimes you will have students who see distortions on the page. And one of the ways you can help with that is to use reading strips or something that isolates text, so they're not looking at an entire page. Fluorescent lights are not good because of the contrast. Or glary paper is not good, or whatever. So anything you can do to reduce visual distortions and visual stress is beneficial. Let's see. Somebody asked about well, let me do this and then I'll come back and see if there are a couple more questions that I want to address. So one of the things that we're going to be sharing with you is a guide that we've created called 4 Literacy Myths of Adult Learners. I think there are a lot of myths about adults, and I think it's important for us to really, again, as instructors and administrators of programs and education principles and corrections and other settings, to understand really that there a lot of things we've believed about adult learners may not be accurate. If you're interested in more information about Reading Horizons Elevate, we'll be sharing that as well. And then the other thing I wanted to let you know about is that the last webinar in this series is on June 6th, and it's applying the science of reading to English language instruction. So that whole webinar will be on working specifically with English language learners. So we're very excited about that with COABE. One thing that people haven't mentioned that I would like to is sometimes people say, well, how important is it for somebody to know that to use the term dyslexia? I mean, in some settings you can't do that, but in other settings you certainly can. And I just think back to the video I showed you with the gentleman who was trying to get an emergency room service for his child and couldn't fill out the forms. If that guy really believes that he's not very smart and there's a lot of shame and embarrassment, what do you think he did? He might have just gone ahead and turned that clipboard right back in without filling it out. It's unlikely he said, I can't read or whatever. Having a label like dyslexia, where in the past we've avoided labels, but an understanding of what dyslexia is can be a game changer. When people understand it is not about intelligence, it's not about the fact that they're lazy, which many teachers have told those students over the years, or they're not trying hard enough, or they don't meet the time requirements to turn in assignments or quizzes and things like that. Accommodations are really, really important for those students, and in most cases, and somebody can certainly speak to the whole issue with GED and other tests that students have to take that are timed, because that can be a huge factor for them. And so many adults don't know that they have dyslexia. And so they just continue to have these beliefs that affect their self-esteem and so many other parts of their world. And knowing that it's dyslexia and there's something you can do about that, I could share so many conversations that I've had with adults and with people who work with adults that talk about how valuable that can be. And how much that does affect motivation, because when students realize this is something I'm going to need to work hard on, but I can achieve and accomplish, even though maybe I've never been able to do that in the past, is incredibly important. So are there any other questions? And let me just check the chat. Yeah, that happens too. Nancy, districts are worried about overdiagnosing students to keep their special ed numbers down. The nice thing about this is that when students are screened early, and when I say early, we can screen students as young as 3 and 4 years old now, but certainly by kindergarten. And what we know is that the sooner we wire the brain, the less impact dyslexia will have over their lifetime. So that means that if we wire the brain early, we may never actually see reading difficulties, which is really important. But by the time an adult gets to us, this is really where we have to know what we're doing. And within corrections, we have, an opportunity they may never have again. Because they're a captive audience. And if we're not using that time as effective as we could, we're missing the opportunity to send someone back into their community with, proficient reading skills, or as proficient as we can. So on the dyslexia screener that I mentioned, the online dyslexia screener, there's one for 4 and 5-year-olds, one for 6 and 7, one for 8 to 18. And so if you're interested in looking at those characteristics, when you go to the online screener, just put in one of those ages and that will pop up. So there are much less items for that. Yeah, you'll see it. I mean, once you know what to look for, it's almost, you can't unsee it. So yeah, the screeners that I mentioned, we'll be sharing the paper and pencil ones. The online screener, all you have to do is go to Google and search Reading Horizons Dyslexia Screener, and it'll pop right up. You just put in an age and it'll take you to the appropriate screener. I think, yeah, great comments. And I'll get a transcript of the chat just to be able to follow up if I need to. But I think the thing to recognize here is that even students who read again, can have dyslexia because it can be very mild. Where they often get into difficulty is with spelling, writing, and those kinds of things. So a lot of times you'll see students who look pretty average, but when you get into the those other tasks like spelling and writing, you'll often see that there starts to be an issue there. That's just another form of dyslexia. So it affects all components, language-based and language processing, connections of print, etc. Okay, so if there are no other questions, so happy that you joined us today. Thank you for the work that you're doing. It's incredibly important. I love that there were so many people on this particular webinar and that a lot of people will be able to share it or view it later, because I think the information is really valuable and we'd love to support in any way that we can. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Reading Horizons. I did launch a poll, so if you could take that before you leave, and you will receive the link for the recording as well as the slides and the information within about 24 hours following the live webinar. So please look in your email for that. And everyone have a great rest of your week. Thank you so much.